And the Philistines took the ark of God. And the hand of the Lord was heavy upon the Azodians, and he destroyed them. And the villages and fields in the midst of the country, there came forth a multitude of mice, and there was great confusion and a great mortality in the city. And he smote the men of the city, both small and great, and they had emerods in their secret parts. So they sent and gathered together the lords of all the Philistines and said, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it go again into its own place, that it slay us not and our people. For there was deadly destruction throughout all the city, and the hand of God was heavy there." The diviners came. They suggested that the lords of the Philistines prepare 5 golden mice and 5 golden emerods, which could be translated as tumors or hemorrhoids, and sent this on a cart with oxen stripped of their calves, and to see where that oxen would carry the ark, and went straight back into Israel. Sort of something for an Indiana Jones sequel, don't you think? 5 golden hemorrhoids. The medical historian J.F. Shrewsbury states, "So runs the record of the Old Testament of a pestilence that it would seem to have exerted a decisive influence upon human history, and to have been in its ultimate effects one of the most important events in the history of the Western world. It caused the Philistines to restore the Ark of the Covenant to the defeated Israelites. That restoration saved Israel from disintegration and almost certain extinction, a loss that would have a profound effect upon the human history. It was Israel who gave us a world religion that has directed the spiritual life of nearly half of mankind." Dr. Shrewsbury goes ahead and in speculation, debunked the idea that it was just the bubonic plague, which you think about in mice and in disease, and suggested it's lower bowel dysentery. And so this is the tone I'd like to set, that we're going to mix some of the secular ideas and speculations with some of the gospel truths that we know and love. From the time of Adam and Eve, when diseases were first introduced into the human family, the dance between men and microbes has greatly influenced history. The Bible may serve as a medical historical text, recording cases and epidemics of disease, their effects and treatment, and the Lord's management of his people in coping with pathological events. Its passages illustrate important historical consequences of infectious illness. It reveals divine intervention in the causing and curing of human disease. The Lord promised our patriarch Abraham a posterity as numerous as the stars of the sea or sands upon the seashore. For Jehovah to fulfill this covenant required more than just cultural identity and spiritual vigor. He gave the prophets knowledge of medical principles and direction for hygienic practice far beyond the cultural information available in their day. One aspect of the Mosaic Law could be ancient rules for public health and freedom from illness. The inspired voice of prophets ensured the increase of population of Israel by Levitical law, by restricting behaviors that spread disease and required certain patterns of diet and hygiene. The seed of Abraham has survived to bless all nations. Well, let's start in the beginning. The genesis, of course, of all physical suffering and the eventuality of death came with our first parents' choice in the garden. The introduction of sickness and pain to the human family brought with it experience necessary to value health and pleasure. The reported longevity of Adam and Methuselah and others seemed that those of that day had some freedom of fatal illness, or at least a better understanding of coping with their environment. Through modern anthropology, many attempts have been made to discover the effects of health and disease upon the rise of civilization and on the human condition. Looking for evidence in skeletons, they estimate the fertility, longevity, morbidity, and mortality of our progenitors. They look for trends as societies become more complex, from hunter-gatherers to nomadic herdsmen to sedentary farmers and communities. These issues are not unlike today as we look for a home for our own families, places of safety, sanitation, whether we're going to live in Provo or Spanish Fork. In the Bible epic, we see this interaction of peoples with each of these society types. We have peoples that are hunters. We have nomadic herdsmen. We see the people leaving Goshen, becoming a sedentary farming folk to a traveling multitude. We see the interaction between these groups that are not blood related, and the mixing of germs and disease as a result. This happens to communities, again, as they meet, not only passively and peaceably, but in warfare. Historians, to better attempt to understand the previous human conditions, have given a lot of attention lately to the effects of disease on shaping our past. For example, Arnaud Clarnin states that in 1528, when France and Spain were fighting for control of Europe, typhus, which is a tick-borne disease, describing typhus meaning smoke, the state of the person just before they die, typhus scourged the French army besieging Naples. Half of the 28,000 French soldiers died, and the siege collapsed. As a result, Charles I of Spain held power over Italy. The Pope, Clement VII, and later, fearing to offend Charles, Clement would refuse a divorce and annulment of England's Henry VIII. Thus, typhus indirectly helped unite England's Reformation and the Civil War that followed, and then, unquote, adding perhaps our restoration. Well, it'd be ridiculous to think that germs dictate all of human history. It's naive to ignore their consequences. And today, particularly college students in the post-polio generation, you have never had the fear that was generated from those past 1955-54. We have my mother-in-law is in a wheelchair result of polio, so it's really a distinct reminder. Polio was actually a result of people living cleaner and with higher sanitations. Polio germ was not given to the individuals till they were healthy young adults. And many here can remember the fear of sending their children to swimming pools. Fortunately, we have been saved, or at least limited, to the exposure of AIDS, a terrible disease that affects so many of our fellow humans in this society. A paragnosis is a speculation in a sense of using historical facts to try to make a diagnosis. You have to understand that even in current medicine, that upwards of a quarter of appendix removed are perfectly healthy. So medicine is still very much an art and a science. Today we will not speculate as much over individual changes, but we'll look at the groups and how they interact. If we look to the Bible through as a medical historical textbook through the lens of faithful gospel scholarship, we can see that the promises made to the patriarch Abram would require that his children have high fertility and excellent fertility, high birth rates, and longevity, and a low death rate. Through the prophet's voice, natural and eternal elements of truth is employed to fulfill his promise. Let's turn to Leviticus. But if you will not hearken unto me, and you will not do all these commandments, and if ye shall despise my statutes, that ye break my covenant, then this I will do to you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, which is a lung disease, and the burning ague that shall consume your eyes. And I will bring 7 times more plagues upon you and your sin. The Bible contains many passages where there's a direct causal relationship between sin and disease. That first record of a plague occurs with Pharaoh as he pursues the lovely wife of Abraham, Sarai. The Pharaoh knows immediately that plague was a result of something he did wrong, and he tends to make that right. There are many other examples of disease. It was used for punishment for speaking against the Lord's anointed spokesman. Of course, the best of these, Moses, Miriam, his sister, becomes leprous for a week after she and Aaron complain about his leadership and his choice of a wife. The faithless spies who brought slanderous report from Cana were also plagued. Also, Uzziah was wroth by the priest for forbidding him to burn incense without priesthood authority. And in defiance, he took the censer in hand and contracted leprosy. And gave us also, I hope, a wonderful picture by Rembrandt. Jehoram, after slaying his brothers and sisters in wickedness, was smote with an incurable disease as prophesied by Elijah. And thou shalt have a great sickness and disease in thy bowels, and thy bowels shall fall out by this reason of sickness day by day. The Syrian Nahum sought out the prophet of Israel, Elisha, and was cured of leprosy. Elisha refused a reward, but his servant, Gehazi, pursued Nahum for the gift and was cursed by the prophet with leprosy, he and his entire household. Also, collective transgression of a whole people can invite the Lord's punishment. The plagues of Pharaoh's Egypt is the preeminent example. When Pharaoh refused to let my people go, Moses struck the waters of the Nile with his staff, and the pure waters turned red like blood. This first plague might have triggered some of the other epidemic events of the other plagues. Dr. Russell Thompson states, medicine sees the plague of Egypt as a sequence of occurrences which were related in epidemics. Microorganisms of the Genodium species can cause red tides, polluting water, killing water life. Diseased amphibians like frogs swarm the land, die and become food for disease-transmitting insect vectors. The death of animals and man soon follow in unprotected populations, end quote. For the next 40 years of wilderness wandering, the posterity of Abraham were purged and scourged, they were schooled to become the Lord's people. At the waters of Merah, Moses promises his people that if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. He mentions this a number of times. The first recorded epidemic to strike the Israelis occurred at Mount Sinai while they were worshiping the golden calf. The calf and the nakedness of the people caused Moses to order the sons of Levi to slay the worst offenders. Then Moses plagued the people because they had made the calf. Some suggest that that was a sexually transmitted disease because of the nakedness. One of the most descriptive is the plague of Moab. When the Israelites pitched their tents on the plain of Moab, Balak sent for the diviner, Balaam. Balaam could not curse the Israelites. He knew that he could not win. But he encouraged the people of Moab to encourage the children of Israel to embrace their gods, and particularly the gods of fertility of that day, which was essentially the pornography of the day. Later, the people began to commit whoredoms with the daughters of Moab and to worship Baal Peor, causing a plague that killed 24,000 Israelites. So blatant was this prostitution that one of the children of Israel had brought a woman within the sight of Moses, and that was the center of the camp. Phinehas took a javelin, went into the tent, thrust the javelin through the man of Israel and the woman of Midian to stay the plague. And apparently to stay the plague meant to quarantine the contagion. Moses recorded that only those men who participated in the fertility cult were destroyed, indicating that this disease also was possibly sexually transmitted. The plague of Moab was recounted by David in Psalms, Joshua, Hosea, and Paul, who said, "Neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed," and fell in one day 3 and 20,000 in 1 Corinthians. Those who fought against a more righteous Israel were often a victim of the Lord's wrath. As literally described as the plagues of the Philistines, another example occurred when Isaiah and the prophet Hezekiah was the king of Judea. When a powerful Assyrian army under Sennacherib, I think I got it right, approached Jerusalem, Hezekiah sought the counsel of the living prophet and prayed for deliverance in the house of the Lord. The Lord answered Isaiah to say, "The king of Assyria will not come into the city, nor shoot an arrow there, for I will defend the city and save it." And that night the angel of the Lord went out, smote the camp of the Assyrians, 185,000, and when they arose in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. The Lord could have used an epidemic of cholera, perhaps a bubonic plague in the pneumonic form to cause a catastrophe that would kill 185,000 soldiers. As we point to all these examples of this causal relation between sin and disease, we need to balance that concept with the inclusion of a very special book, the book of Job, a narrative different than all others in the Old Testament. Here we see that disease also affects those who are righteous for the tempering of the spirit and for experience while in the flesh. But generally, men and women who seek to follow the prophet's words have been blessed regarding to prevention of disease and the maintenance of health. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Mosaic Law now. In the 15th chapter of Leviticus, there's a remarkably accurate description of the spread of infection. And of course, our keynote speaker, Dr. Russell M. Nelson, said, "And if any man hath a running issue out of his flesh, because of that issue he is unclean. Thus our loving Heavenly Father has clearly revealed the principle and technique of handling infected patients over 3,000 years ago." Of the total 613 biblical commands and prohibitions, 213 are found in the book of Leviticus in a form of social hygiene and sanitary regulations. In Leviticus, the terms of pure, clean, or impure, unclean, applied to theological as well as practical concepts of holiness, healthfulness, and separateness. These concepts of hygiene were applied to the individual, the family, the tribe, and nation, with the regulation of diet, sexual contact, isolation after illness. And it's really the easy ones, the 5 types of defilement: diet, discharge, delivery, death, dermatitis. Even specific instructions for dealing with human waste was included. Thou shalt have a place without the camp, and thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon. And it shall be that when thou wilt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt dig therewith, and shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. Sounds like something from the old Boy Scout manual. The concept of uncleanness and purifying with water has ritualistic as well as practical applications, as is baptism or washing one's hands before the dinner. An excellent example of this process is described in Numbers chapter 31. Moses has just received the spoils of the victorious Israelites who've annihilated the Midianites. Returning from battle, all who had contact with the enemy, as well as the captives, were commanded to stay without the camp for 7 days. Of the conquered females, only virgins were allowed to live, thus protecting the nation from any sexually transmitted diseases. All clothing and gear made out of wood was purified. All the metal loot and other things that may abide fire was cleansed in the fire. Those items that may not abide not in the fire were cleansed with water. All clothing was washed on the 7th day before entrance was allowed into the camp. And it seemed like you could have an outside entrance, but then gradually work your way in, ritualistically and as an issue of cleanliness. Similar regulations, of course, applied to contact with the dead, treating infested houses, and the dealing with food. To maintain the religious identity, Abraham's covenant posterity, the Lord required Israel to be separate from the world. The main token of this covenant and a physical reminder of the promise of the Lord was the circumcision of all males. Many have speculated to the medical benefit of surgical removing of the foreskin, not just hygienically for the man, but for also his partner. There's one simple detail pertaining to the execution of this commandment which has some interest. To prevent the excessive bleeding in the newborn, it's performed on the 8th day of life. An important component of clotting in the blood, prothrombin, is depleted at birth and is not replenished in the child's liver until about the 8th day of life, thus saving a lot of morbidity in the most commonly done surgery in the world, circumcision. The Lord's required isolation was evident as Joshua led the tribes across the River Jordan to destroy the 7 nations. The carnage commanded by the Lord in Canaan has been difficult for us to justify by today's standard. The utter destruction of all in Jericho, men, women, children, and the animals, and the burning of the city were brutal acts, but in the context of public health, possibly a necessity to preserve the Lord's people. The proximity between people and animals brought a lot of sharing of microbes, called the technical term zoonosis. The slaying of both men and beasts in Jericho, and later the slaying of Acunan, who was the person who stole some of those things and kept it in his own household and his whole family, would definitely protect, at least in part, the populace from any of Jericho's germs. Joshua was given the commandment that each nation that he conquered, he was told to burn some cities, save some animals, allowing some to become servants, but generally he destroyed all that had breath, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. Again, through the prophet Moses, the Lord had promised that if they smite and destroy them, the Lord would take away all sicknesses and put none of the disease of Egypt, which thou knowest, upon thee. The prophet's policy of separateness protected the Israelites from religious and cultural pollution, but perhaps from many contagious disease. To assure a successful posterity, Abraham's people would require also a high fertility rate. Before the advent of penicillin, sexually transmitted diseases, or STDs, was the main cause of sterility and infant blindness and death. And that's why the drops in the children's eyes, which is demonstrated or shown here. The prohibition of adultery, fornication, sexual perversion, close family marriages, and divorce prevented STDs, inbreeding of genetic defects and illegitimacy today as well as in the past. Dr. Russell Thompson again. God had promised his people that if they followed his laws, that they would be more fertile than the heathen people in the surrounding nations. It was partially guaranteed by the prohibition of sexual relations until the 14th day after the menstrual cycle. Basically, the day the normal woman ovulates and is the most fertile. The Levitical laws have grouped all animals either clean and acceptable to eat or unclean and not to be eaten or even touched. Generally, this divided the animal kingdom into herbivores and carnivores. The meat of a clean animal was allowed to be eaten, but not their blood. And here's the good one for today. Also, the fat was not to be consumed by man, but could be burned in lamps. Animals that died from illness or attack from other animals could not be eaten. We know about this today with mad cow. The animal that drew the most abhorrence in the public record and parable was, of course, the swine. The transmission of trichinosis, which is a worm, from hog to man was also cited as of interest of medical import. Perhaps even more important today is the potential of viral transmission in swine. Today in southern China, the Center of Disease Control sets up stations and looks for new viral strains of the Asian. And the reason is that the close proximity of that particular culture of swines, birds, or ducks, and humans. The swine is the most important intermediary from the transfer of virus from a mobile reservoir, which is in ducks, through the swine to the human. And so that's why we have that shot every year. Usually comes from the continued work there as they look for new strains. Another interesting comment on meat. You know, we've been hearing a lot about the FDA lately and hepatitis A and B. The priests essentially were the FDA of the day. And so when you look at that kosher pickles or those little signs, the little circle K or the little U, indicate that again, a priest has also helped, because even though we expect all of our food to be clean, it was a huge and important issue at the time of the Old Testament. The Mosaic Law primary purpose was to develop a holy nation unto God. With its prescription of holiness came valuable hygienic practices that served to promote wellness of Israel. The isolation of the ill, the transmission of infection, the disinfection of the defiled, and the quarantine with observation all appear to be part of the Mosaic Law, and all had epidemiological worth today. Talk a little bit about healing, and this could go on for a long period of time, but just like to do some unique parts. The Lord provided direct healing to the afflicted in many biblical examples. Our Creator knows and controls the laws governing the human spirit as well as physical wellness. The process of individual healing begins by the individual exercising faith in groups or by priesthood authority. One of the best examples in Scripture is recorded in 2 Kings in the days of Hezekiah, who was nigh unto death. The prophet Isaiah came to him and said, Thus saith the Lord, set thine own house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. And he, Hezekiah, prayed to the Lord, saying, O Lord, now that I have walked to thee in truth with a perfect heart. And the word of the Lord came unto Isaiah, saying, Tell Hezekiah that I have heard his prayers, and behold, I will heal thee, and I will add to thy days 15 years. And Isaiah said, Take a lump of figs, and they took it and laid it on the boil on his foot, and he recovered. A lot of interesting ideas in folk medicine. We could talk about the use of molds, which of course is a precursor to penicillin that we use today. We're all used by the ancients. Hezekiah's healing had all the elements of divine intervention: living righteously, asking the Lord in prayer, then following exactly the instructions of the living prophet. Another bad example is, and Asa was diseased in his feet, yet in his disease he sought not the Lord, but to the physicians. And Asa slept with his fathers and died. Many other customs of healing in biblical times are evident and recorded in the Talmud. And healing in Hebrew also has the connotation of forgiveness. Brock points out that the Talmud enumerates 4 ways to avert death: charitableness, prayer, personal and collective, receiving a new name, and changing one's life. In Proverbs it says, righteousness or charitableness delivers one from death. And this underlines a tradition in many cultures of distributing gifts to the poor. Individual and collective prayer is needed for the Lord's healing. Some interesting points. Those who are ill for more than one day must ask others to pray for their healing. The prayer of pious men is particularly effective. And physicians also should pray for healing. Dr. Larry Dossey, who's been quoted a lot lately in the Reader's Digest and the Wall Street Journal, talking about the effects of prayer, and he uses a term called a non-local event, where there is in the medical journal now situations where individuals pray without the knowledge of a group for others, and the positive effects there. Exciting work. New names. They suggest that the opening of the Torah, that you would change your name in a sense to become a new person, trying to shed, again, this idea of forgiveness and moving ahead in our lives. And then changing one's life. And I have an example of my own son. A year ago, went over a train track playing with a quarter and got stuck in his throat. It's very interesting when he's not in grave danger, which would scare me, but we went to the emergency room, and it was very interesting, his prayer in the car, and how he just naturally turns to praying and saying, Father, I'll never do this again, type of a prayer. And fortunately, with the priesthood blessing, he went to get an x-ray, and they have one x-ray with that quarter in, and then next one without. So we've been blessed in many ways with healing in our culture. One of the great theological questions of all day and of all ages is regarding healing, when the art and science of the world's physicians ends and when the power of the Lord begins. Fortunately, in our wonderful religion and wonderful way of life, we've been blessed to embrace truth as well as maintain our cultural and spiritual heritage as portrayed in the Bible. Though the Bible contains many descriptive symptoms in the suffering of those afflicted, it's impossible to identify specific diseases today in terms of modern medicine. There's 3 important reasons why this is difficult. First of those is the difficulty in translating the descriptive words of the day, and I've given some of those in the handout. There's also the change with disease in time. Diseases generally become less lethal as they mutate. And the last thing is the translation difficulty. The best example of this, of course, is leprosy, which is the most often named disease in the Old and New Testaments. Leprosy was what, unfortunately, termed in modern medicine Hansen's disease. And though now treatable with sulfa drugs, Hansen's disease still ranks as the 10 most common cripplers, with over 15 million people affected worldwide. The bacteria M. leprae causes skin patches, lumps, inflamed peripheral nerves. It thickens and destroys nerve trunks, causing loss of sensation, damage, and disfigurement. Its transmission is unknown, but contrary to the biblical leprosy and precautions, leprosy is one of the least contagious of all diseases, with an incubation period from 3 to 20 years. There's many questions, and you can pursue that on your own leisure, but there's a few things that definitely indicates that Hansen's disease was not the leprosy of the Bible. The whiteness of the skin described in the Bible was not a symptom of modern leprosy. In fact, they feel that the true leprosy came to the Middle East with Alexander Great's armies as they returned from India. Sararat is frequently used in the Bible to describe the description of leprosy. And it describes conditions ranging from ringworm to psoriasis, and possibly a form of Hansen's disease. In the root, Sara is translated as hornet or wasp, which described a sting. The term was developed at a time when specific medical diagnosis was limited. And when you really look at this table, they have 3 different Hebrew words are translated as simply as spot, and 3 more as scab. It's obvious that these priests at that time knew more about what we can understand as their description. And what does scald or blain mean to us today? When men and microbes interact, they change and adapt over time. microbes and diseases usually become less lethal. But the idea of contagion in the Bible has only been recently understood, but the idea planted a good seed in Western medicine. In fact, the word quarantine comes from the Italian word quora, which is 40, which is the days of clarity or of cleanliness needed to become clean. So this is immersed in our medical as well as our culture. Let's finish now. In learning the hand of the Lord in ancient experience guides us to recognize His hand in our own modern situation. As we link His ancient teachings with those actual experience today of the people, we see our Heavenly Father's plan unfold in our lives. As today in the past, the Lord desires His people to be healthy and physically able to seek Him. But sickness is always a part of the human experience. And when suffering strikes, we often ask as disciples, Lord, who has sinned? We must be careful never to judge, but remember Job and his afflictions, and gain experience as we all are afflicted. Seeking the Lord's healing is as important today as in the past. Medical doctors cure, the Lord heals. With the success of modern medical technologies, many rely solely upon science. But by the direction of our great Latter-day Prophets, we're able to embrace all the truth and recognize the source of the great physician. Modern prophets' word of wisdom have demonstrated in our day the Lord's desire to promote His holistic wellness to all who can hear. Biblical passages point the important historical consequences of implementing these teachings of the living prophet into our daily lives. Because of lack of reliable medical terminology and difficult in translation, ancient elements cannot be accurately identified with the modern counterpart. But God's guidance, as recorded in prophetic utterance in scriptural and practice and culture, proved to be a very effective way in identifying and containing contagious diseases. As the posterity of Abraham, we share the same promise made to the patriarchs. We seek not only for longevity, but total wellness that yields abundant life. The medical challenges and the spiritual dysfunctions of this world can be addressed by listening to the living prophet's voice and seeking truth and healing by study, by faith, and by spiritual vigor. May we seek the Lord's healing, I pray, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
A set of 4 videocassettes featuring 8 lectures from the 1997 Sperry Symposium, The Old Testament, Voices of the Prophets, is available from the BYU Creative Works catalog by calling 1-800-962-8061 or visit us online at the address on your screen. The cost is $29.95 plus shipping and handling.